I am DM Zone. This is Gamers Oasis. Let's get into it. Okay, guys, so we're going to talk about some fantasy stuff here. We're talking about fantasy combat in original Dungeons and Dragons, which actually started in the 1973 third edition version of Chainmail. I've talked about that video, about that game, a lot in a different video. I recommend checking it out if you want to learn more about it. There's a lot of stuff in there. I'm going to probably do more videos covering it to try and build up what exactly is and how it related to Chainmail, to original Dungeons and Dragons. Okay, so like I said, the fantasy portion, the fantasy appendix as they called it, was introduced into Chainmail 3rd edition. It was not part of the original game. It was not part of the original layout. It was something that Gygax, pretty much for the most part in his own, came up with after playing a game of with Dave Arneson, which was a Brownstein mixed in with some fantasy stuff, mixed in with some diplomacy and these type of things. And then later, when they went back and he played with Chainmail, Arneson really loved the addition of Chainmail to their game, and elements of that was then incorporated in place of like the Napoleonic and all those type of things that were more of the classic version of a historical game, making for an interesting marriage of things. Now, that wasn't their forever game. Their game evolved again from that later, but that's a whole different thing. But for sure, they fed each other the element that they were kind of the creators of, and then that became what we know as original Dungeons and Dragons. And I would definitely say that they both knew they had something, like it was the new peanut butter and jelly of that time era, but for wargaming. Interestingly enough, though, Jeff Perrin, one of the co-authors for Chainmail, probably wasn't as much of a fan. Uh, reports that I have read and interviews I've seen basically stated that he didn't feel that this was a needed element within the game, that the game was working just fine, that if you wanted to do that, it wasn't like he was against it, just go do it in your own game that you create, not a game that we created type of thing. I don't know if he ever really changed off of that. But I can understand probably why it happened because, resources were scarce and he already had a dog that could dance, shall we say. One of the things I noticed early on when I was reading the fantasy appendix was that it started to focus a lot more on the scale of the miniature, of how big it was, how many millimeters the base was, and this type of stuff. I don't necessarily think this is more of a thing that they were focusing on than others. I think what this actually is that there was less regulation. There was no miniature company making fantasy miniatures like this for a standardized size. So therefore, a lot of the miniatures you had were stuff that you made out of old toys that you bought from the dime store, where you get your little dinosaurs or your little figurines or whatever, or you carve something up out of wood or something, these type of things. Versus having a proper pewter-sized miniature or lead miniature from back then, that you would have a standard-sized base. And of course, if your Conan miniature is at 54 millimeters and all your other troops are at 30 millimeters and your cavalry is not 54 millimeter, then it kind of makes that sort of an odd mix that Conan is literally bigger than the horseman riding next to him or against him. So you run into some problems. Today, we don't experience the same problem. Pretty much everything we have is standardized at 25, 28 millimeter. Usually the miniature's height will be 28, the base itself will be 25. Now, there are 30 millimeter bases in certain fantasy games like Warhammer Fantasy Battle, and there's 40 millimeter bases. And then there are the 40 by 80 millimeter bases for like cavalry and chariots and that type of stuff that you'll find. You'll find these around, but they're all fairly standardized within the same game, and they kind of expect you to use their miniatures when you're playing. So let's go back to the fantasy appendix, the 15 pages you find in the third edition of Chainmail. It added a lot to the game. It wasn't just 15 pages. There was a huge amount of creative influence put into it, and then you took that and kind of did what you sort of wanted. For example, for the races and whatnot, it added instead of having human and human and human, which might be, Korean and Japanese and Chinese or Viking or some Middle Eastern group and some European group and so on and so on. It changed that to where you still had those, but then you also added things in there like hobbits, aka halflings, after the Tolkien estate told them to change it. Really told old D&D to change it. They didn't catch it until later. But you had sprites, you had pixies, you had dwarves, you had gnomes, you had goblins, elves, orcs, heroes, superheroes, and wizards. Now, that's most of the good guys, most of the people that would be on one side of things, or some of them are. Goblins, obviously not. But then you get into some of the more fantastic mythological type creatures like giants and dragons and elementals and wraiths and lycanthropes, trolls, treants, again, kind of approached by the J.R. Tolkien estate, rocks, basilisks, cockatrice, chimeras, giant spiders, giant insects, and then you have giant wolves, and of course, wights. The ye old wight, one of the most terrifying things in low-level original Dungeons and Dragons because it just takes away your levels. But they didn't end with that. They also added some new items to the game. Things like magic weapons, enchanted arrows, and magical armors. And those were on the magical side. Now they put that in there with things that already existed, like some form of flight. Now, in this case, it wouldn't be like mundane flight. It wouldn't be a little glider going across the battlefield or a blimp or something of that nature. No. Now we have dragons flying across the dragon's field. Basically, if you have a dragon, it is its field. But the battlefield. And they also had other things like, sieges and those type of things, trebuchets. Well, now you start to incorporate things in there with trolls and maybe have burning boulders so it does extra damage, and that causes its own little thing. It changed the game significantly. Also, I've spoken about the other two styles of combat so far. You had the 1 in 20, or the mass combat, as I like to call it, which basically was a binary system where a hit equals death and a miss equals a miss. There wasn't hit points, there wasn't those type of things. And then you had the man-to-man, which could be a hit equals death, but generally it was based around hit points, and you were able to go ahead, at least in original Dungeons & Dragons, and Chainmail is probably hit equals death. It would kind of go into this thing where you would have this back and forth and this sort of dance, this little two-step you'd have where you'd have the figure A as the attacker and figure D as the defender, and that would pretty much stay the same when you had weapon class and all that. Okay, so parts of both of these systems are in fantasy. You have the binary of if you hit, you die, and then you have the other half of it is if you roll 2d6, and then you go ahead and add that to a target number to see if you roll below it, equal it, or go above it. Now that's slightly different than it was in man-to-man. They didn't have that, but that means different things. So if you roll above it, the hit equals death, according to at least the fantasy version of Chainmail. You could incorporate hit points into that, but I'd leave that to the game master or the group to decide how important that is because of how hard sometimes it is to get these hits. I haven't really played around with this enough to really give my full breadth of opinion on it, but I could see how either one of these could be very beneficial. I'll get into why it just doesn't always just happen. But let's go ahead and get into what else there was. So if you equaled it and you did not actually hit, then it was considered to be that they could do one move to move out of combat or to move away. And then if you rolled below the target number you need to do, then what that meant is that there was no effect. So being able to fall back a move allows you to re-engage, allows you to maybe do range attacks, allows you to maybe run away. There's a lot of dynamic in that. And this was a free move. Like it didn't you didn't get attacked because you moved out of this. And that's kind of like a way to disengage without a morale test, which was something that wasn't really common in this game. Basically, you fought to the death or until someone broke with their morale. One of the other interesting things it takes or doesn't take into consideration is it doesn't care what armor you're wielding. It doesn't care what kind of weapon you're wielding. It depends on who you are as a person. Are you a hero? Are you for people that might equal a hero? If you're not, then you're not on the chart. So if you have 3 halflings, those 3 halflings cannot be a hero unless they happen to be 4 hit dice. So they're not going to be able to affect anything on this. They don't get an attack, which is crazy. I mean, technically they're flailing around and doing stuff, but none of it is meaningful because the weapons doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if you have a magic weapon until you actually hit or if you can't attack. You actually have to be able to get up to the attack, and it requires 4 hit dice to be able to attack as a hero, 8 to attack as a superhero. So if you didn't have that, then you didn't do that. And that's kind of a thing. Like a chimera is a fantasy creature. 2 chimeras run into the battlefield. They can attack each other. But a mere human cannot hurt a chimera until he gets to a certain level of threat. And then he gets an attack, which is pretty crazy. So that's kind of a thing. Now, magic weapon in the right hands gets an attack. It's very effective. So this is why hit points may or may not be a thing, because if you could only attack when you have 4 hit dice attacking at one time or within a period of time, and you only get 1 attack, then adding hit points to that, so where a creature could take multiple hits, really does take it into the realm of like legendary mythological creatures that you may or may not want to go into. However, it was these changes, the addition of the fantasy races, the addition to your weapon doesn't actually matter, who you are as a person matter, what your personal strength is, this type of thing, this Conan the Barbarian type of thing. He picks up a random person's sword and kills more people with that sword than the entire army that fought beside it a minute ago. That type of thing. Those things were cool and were evocative to people who read a lot of these Pulp Fictions back in the day. To give you an idea of the type of people that read this, the word ET space OL is used in some circles as a way to say and all. So it's, I believe, Latin. So if you're in, like, if you ever read a deed, if you ever Google someone's deed, and it will end with et al. And what that means is literally and everything else, basically. And that's kind of a weird thing to have in a war game designed for teenagers, because I bet you most adults don't even know about the existence of that word or what it means. If they saw it, they'd be like, oh, someone misspelled a word, and they'd move on. But that's not the case. So I found that very interesting and different. Continuing on with a little bit what's different. The man-to-man combat rolls 2d6. They hit, they get to do damage. It's kind of a back and forth. It has a whole thing about parrying and all this type of stuff and multiple attacks. These things don't exist in the fantasy combat. You don't parry. You don't have the multiple attacks. I feel like there's a decent game within that, but they never explored it. And I don't think it would work as it currently is wrote, and you could just adapt it and make some small changes. But I think a person, if they wanted to dedicate enough time into it, could. There's a lot of things that you'd have to take into consideration. For example, weapon class. Weapon class in man-to-man goes 1 to 12. If you start having a weapon class of 14, it's going to weaken while strengthening your character at the same time, because multiple attacks could come back at it. So I don't know if incorporating weapon class into the fantasy system is a good thing if one were to start there, and that's kind of the baseline for man-to-man. But I kind of like that it takes, if you have 5 halflings and they're attacking, they count as 1 hero. and then all their attacks combine, and they basically get one hero, and there's like one extra little attack over there, and then the next two attacks count, and then you get one extra little attack over there instead of having two or whatever, or three. Instead of one, you have two, and it builds up, and all of a sudden, boom, boom, you get your second attack type of thing. That actually has a very second edition or AD&D feel to it. And this was wrote way before that, where you had like the 3x2 and the 5x2 type of thing, and the 3x3 where you got just 3 attacks around. And if you ever were so lucky, you had the 7x2, which means you had 4 attacks, 3 attacks, 4 attacks, 3 attacks, and that's kind of how it went. Now, if they happen to have 10, the way the rules are wrote, you wouldn't go with like 2 hero attacks. You go with 1 superhero attack, and then you have 2 extra attacks basically that push through. And if you had 20 attacks, you still would go with a superhero attack, because you wouldn't get multiple superhero attacks in the same turn. But basically, you'd be all loaded up and ready to go next turn for your superhero attack. Or maybe they just didn't carry the round over. Maybe you got 1. And if you had 3, you never got to 4. And if you had 5, you never got to 2 in the same turn. That's never actually clearly defined. I could just see it being played either way, depending on how forgiving the referee, or dungeon master as we would call it now, would be towards such things. What this kind of does is it gets rid of the swinginess of the mass combat. In mass combat, a superhero in heavy armor with a 2-handed sword jumps into combat, counts as a heavy troop on foot or maybe on horseback, and then counts as maybe a heavy or an armored troop on horseback, or an armored counts as an armored foot troop, or maybe a heavy horseman. Or if they're with their great weapon, they would count as a heavy troop for either mounted or non-mounted. So they would get 4 to 8 attacks depending on what they're attacking, unless they were fighting something equal to them per attack, and that's 8 attacks because they're 8th level, which means that at minimum against most things you're going to have 16 to 32 attacks, which means you're absolutely devastating. Doing it this way gets rid of that swinginess of, oh, I have a hero, I have a superhero. Everything is completely different now. Basically where the superhero is killing more people than they could actually reach in a round of combat, like some sort of Kung Fu Theater ninja type of thing. But with Quentin Tarantino as like the director in an older version of these movies. You get the general idea. So I don't know. I kind of like this. I definitely feel like it has a place. I feel like this is the first step towards a good thing. And if I were to spend time and to really work on this, and it would take a lot of time, I think that something really good could come from it that would be enjoyable. I probably would not use that at all, though, in my process. Anyways, guys, if you like this video, hit the like, hit the subscribe. Let me know down in the comments if I missed anything, if I got anything wrong. I'd love to hear from you guys. Keep enjoying these videos. I hope I'm enjoying making them, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Keep rolling those dice. Bye.